We did it! I still can't believe we got this project done so fast and so well.
When I'm in New York.
I'm in Chicago.
And I'm in LA.
But
we're making it happen in Miro.
Together.
Our best work just happens faster on Miro's collaborative online whiteboard. No more scheduling meeting after meeting for work that could happen
from anywhere. Whether it's getting design feedback here,
mapping timelines here,
or brainstorming next steps here. It all just happens on the Miro board.
Exactly. And it's nice not having to wait an entire day to get sign-off from this guy.
Hey! Well, it is true.
See how Miro users save up to 80 hours every year by meeting less and doing more. Get on board at Miro.com. The first 3 boards are free, forever. That's MIRO.com.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 370, interview with Peter Bradley about his book, The Last Train, A Family History of the Final Solution. Peter Bradley was a Labour MP between 1997 and 2005. More recently, he co-founded and directed Speaker's Corner Trust, a charity which promotes freedom of expression, open debate, and active citizenship in the UK and developing democracies. He has written, usually on politics, for a wide range of publications, including The Times, The Guardian, The Independent, The New Statesman, and The New European. Mr. Bradley, thank you for being with us today.
Not at all. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on, besides your well-written book, was you talk about your family's time during the Second World War in Germany, in Europe, but at the same time, you use their story, if you will, as a way to kind of cover, in a broad sense, a history of anti-Semitism. So was that your inclination when you first set out, or was it mostly just to tell their story, but then you had to dig deeper to figure out why all this was going on?
Yes, that's precisely it. The way the book developed is almost a mystery to me, because I didn't start out to write a book.
Right.
I set out with a very limited ambition. I wanted to find out. I knew what had happened to my grandmother in Latvia, to which my grandparents were deported in 1941, but I didn't know what happened to my grandfather. I wanted to see if I could find out more. And oddly enough, what really got the whole process going was that I wanted to follow the route of the train that deported them from their home in Bamberg in Bavaria via Nuremberg to Riga. That was a very limited ambition, and I can't tell you why I felt the need to do that. And paradoxically, it's one of the few things I didn't ever establish in the process of my research. But it was that question that I asked, what was the train route, that led me from one question to another, to another, to another, until, I distilled it into 2 questions. The first I've touched on, what happened to my grandparents, and the second, and perhaps more profound, was why did it happen? What awful accumulation of ideas and events led to that moment when my families, my grandparents' former friends, their neighbors, the people they'd done business with, the people who came and shopped at their draper store, what led them to put my grandparents on a train and on that train to Latvia. And, it isn't enough to say, oh, the Nazis did it. I mean, where did the Nazis come from? How did the Nazis find it so relatively straightforward to mine and revive ancient hatreds? Where did those hatreds come from? How did they develop over the time? And what was the impact on my family's lives and those of the people that they lived with, the Jewish community of their part of Germany and Europe in general? So, as you say, my I've used what we know of my family's history, which goes back, according to the records we have, and to the late 15th century. I've used my family's history and their experiences to try to illuminate a much broader and longer history.
Well, you bring up a good point, because someone had to be in those Nazi uniforms. Someone has to be in these soldier uniforms. And not to get too political, but we're seeing a lot of that today. So you ask this question, how could my family's neighbors turn on them? Well, as we're seeing today, if you can make a society fearful or make them nervous or uncertain about the future, I think they think less and feel more, and they normally go off of their negative emotions. And yeah, I think the Nazis were able to brilliantly underwhelm the moral compass of the German people, and they were able to get away with a lot of things up until they were literally stopped by other armies.
Well, that's very true. I mean, the Germans were in a particular set of circumstances after the First World War, and there were many contributors to the rise of the Nazis and then what followed. It was the humiliation of the defeat in the First World War. It was the shame attached to that. It was the really rigorous and perhaps unjust reparations that the Allies heaped on them. It was the economic collapse, the Great Depression, hyperinflation. It was the weakness of the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic. These all contributed to a set of circumstances that the Nazis were willing and very able to exploit. And they literally said, to the German people, we will make you great again. This is Germany's destiny.
Right.
Deutschland über alles. That's exactly what it means. Germany first. Germany above all. They played on the perceived weaknesses, and critically they told them, you couldn't. We are a heroic people. There's no way we could have been brought low in this way had it not been for fifth columnists, had it not been for the enemy within. And who was the enemy within? Well, of course, it was the Jews. And it was the Jews because the Jews have always been the scapegoat down the ages. They were able to exploit the germ of what I called earlier an ancient hatred that never really goes away. Sometimes it waxes strong, sometimes it wanes, but it's always there. And it can be called up by people who are ruthless and determined, and indeed the Nazis were both.
Right. You make a good point, because nationalism is one of those double-edged swords that if you use properly, like, say, America coming together in the 1960s to put a man on the moon kind of thing, that's when your national pride can serve a positive purpose. But then there's obviously the other side, and the Nazis did that brilliantly by working the people up, telling them what they wanted to hear. And the best part of their message was, like you said, this is not your fault. If it wasn't for the Jews, we would be a powerhouse. They're the ones who brought us low, and we have to get our revenge and remove them so we can be great once again.
Well, that's precisely it. And of course, that technique has been used innumerable times down the ages. It is still in use today from unscrupulous populists. And when we turn our back on reason, we turn our back on justice too, and all kinds of things become possible. And interestingly, it was Plato back in the time of the Athenian democracy, whose objection to democracy, because he wasn't himself a democrat, was that it was too easy for unscrupulous populists to mislead the people, to lead the people astray. And it was a dangerous politic to adopt. Well, I think we might differ with Plato in terms of our attitude to democracy, but he was quite right about its vulnerability.
Absolutely, because you just, a couple of minutes ago, you just mentioned all the unique set of circumstances that came together after the Great War that Hitler and the Nazis took advantage of. I would think that today people don't really bother with waiting for events. They create their own drama, their own lies, their own emergency or their own crises, if you will, so they can then stand up and say, hey, I'm the person that can solve them, even though a lot of it has been generated by social media.
Well, that's right, but there is always a common element, and that is there has to be an enemy, and usually an enemy within that has to be overcome in order that those of us who are, sufficiently pure in the Nazis' case, were sufficiently Aryan, so that they can succeed, they can triumph. So there must be somebody who must be brought low. There must be somebody who is responsible for the problems that we're facing, for the humiliation or the shame that we feel, and in the vanquishing of whom we will overcome and we will be great again. And that's the constant danger of this kind of politics.
Absolutely. So a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned that you had not initially set out to write a book, but you have written stuff before, articles or whatever. But I guess this just maybe somehow evolved into a book, as these things do. But I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about yourself besides my cursory introduction at the beginning of this episode.
Well, I've had a kind of, I suppose, a varied career. I started in social research. I worked for a research center called the Center for Contemporary Studies. And from there, which was pretty poorly remunerated, I have to say. So from there, I moved into something that was a little better remunerated, which was public affairs.
Right.
I ended up with my own very small company, but I had always had an interest in politics. I served on Westminster City Council as a Labour member in the 80s and 90s. And incidentally, in the recent local elections in the UK just a couple of weeks ago, Labour won Westminster for the first time in its history, which is very exciting.
Wow.
Yes. Sadly, I stepped down 25 years ago. But I stepped down in order to fight and win my seat in Parliament. So I was an MP for a number of years.
Right.
A Labour MP. And after that, I co-founded a charity called Speakers Corner Trust, which is a small charity, but one that is dedicated to promoting freedom of expression, public debate, and active citizenship. And it's something very close to my heart because, society or certainly democracy is only as good as we collectively make it. And if we leave it to others, we will end up where many of us are today, in an unhappy situation where our democracy is weakened, where the rights and freedoms to which we attach so much importance are in retreat. And as I say, that's because I believe in many cases we don't take our own part in making a democracy vital and thriving. We don't take that part as seriously as we can. We always have time to twiddle around on social media, but we don't have time to support our own democracy.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that at the end of it after talking about the Nazis and the history of the Holocaust, but you're right. I mean, this organization, we should be able to get together, talk, discuss, debate, disagree without fist flying, without violence, without personal attacks. Because like you said, it's almost like anything else. The more you put into it, the more you get out of it. And if you don't participate, complaining about it won't do any good because you weren't there when you were needed the most.
Well, that's right. And I think, incidentally, that's one of the ways in which Nazism took hold in Germany in the 30s. The Nazi Party never actually won a kind of majority in the Reichstag,
Right.
But once it had seized power, it started to oppress its opponents, starting with its political opponents, the Social Democrats, the Socialists, the Communists.
Right.
It started to take hold and control of the press and media. And then it started with relatively small steps to set out on the route that it took that led ultimately to the invasion of most of Europe and the implementation of the Holocaust. And there were small steps which people, after the war in particular, Germans after the war said, well, we didn't really notice. We didn't know we were on this
right.
And in some cases, you could say, well, perhaps we can see that that's the case. But it was also very, I think, convenient for people to say, yeah, well, we didn't really know what was happening. Yeah. What we did see was that our living conditions were getting a bit better. You know, there was more or less full employment. The economy was stabilized. Mm-hmm. We had a military again. We felt, a certain national pride. Things were getting better. Right. And so we went along with it. But it was, it was basically the suspension of belief, the suspension of moral engagement that allowed these kinds of things to happen. And what I find particularly interesting, actually, in looking at that era, is not so much the people who went along with it. And it wasn't just Germans, of course. In many of the countries, including Latvia, where my grandparents were murdered, there were collaborators. Now, some of them were willing, very willing, because they were Nazi sympathizers or they were, aggressive anti-Semites. Some of them went along for the plunder, and some went along because everybody else was, and some went along because they were frightened not to. But what's particularly interesting to me is those very few countries where people said, no, this isn't the right thing to do. We can see it for what it is. This is not what we want to be as a society. And we are going to resist. The examples are very few, but there are some.
Right.
I could go into those now or later if you want. Up to you.
We'll tell you. Well, let's go into it a little bit later after we establish kind of stuff that happens with your family, and we can juxtapose that. So let's jump into this story, this incredible story about your parents. Let's start with your father. Could you tell us a little bit about him and when his troubles started happening with the state?
Yeah, my father was born in 1915. His father was away on the front line in the First World War. He was a proud Prussian, patriotic German, and a veteran of the First World War. Right. So my father was born in the early part of the First World War, brought up in Bamberg, a beautiful city in Bavaria, a city that he loved all his life, indeed, and to which he returned in later life on an annual basis when he met up with old school friends for their reunions. But he would have been 18 years old when the Nazis came to power. He was just finishing school. He recounts in a very brief family history that he wrote in later life, I think in the 1990s, that he was the last Jewish student to graduate from the school he attended. He was the only one at the graduation ceremony who didn't throw out a Hitler salute. And he said at the time that his headmaster, his principal, grasped him all the more warmly by the hand for that that statement.
Right.
My father had a habit of seeing the best in people, so it's not always he's not always the most reliable witness, although it's to his credit that he saw the best in people. But of course, at the age of 18, he ought to have had the world at his feet. He came from a relatively prosperous family background. He was the only child. He had a fascination with science that he sustained for the rest of his life. He was desperately keen to go to university, but by that time, of course, he was not allowed to go to university as a Jew. In fact, there was precious little he was allowed to do. Right. So he took up an apprenticeship at a quite a big draper's firm called Schwarzschild Ochs in Frankfurt. They also had branches in London, so it was quite a well known company. Because my grandfather had a draper's shop in Bamberg, and of course he was very keen that that his son would succeed him. So off my father went to Frankfurt. And it was there that he was overtaken, as every Jew in Germany and Austria was, by Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass on the 9th of November 1938.
Here's a question for you. What would you do to save humanity? And how far would you go to stop someone who is getting in your way? The ancient rivalry of assassins and Templars cuts to the heart of good versus evil. But it wasn't always clear who was good and who is evil. Plug in to explore the amazing world of medieval feuds. Echoes of History, Assassins vs. Templars is a special collaboration between History Hit and Ubisoft, the masterminds behind the Assassin's Creed games. Hosted by Dan Snow from History Hit and Matt Lewis from Gone Medieval, together they will take a close look at the real history of the secret societies, which inspired the Assassin's Brotherhood and the Templar Order in the Assassin's Creed games. Plus, they will bring on other premier historians as they discuss unearthing the myths of the Grail and who really was the inspiration for the main characters in the game. Echoes of History, Assassins vs. Templars podcast is available right now wherever you get your podcasts. Listen and subscribe to Echoes of History today to discover the hidden truths that have shaped our world and inspired the video game series. That's Echoes of History, wherever you get your podcasts. Listen today and subscribe for more. Yeah, his whole life, like you said, his whole life should have been ahead of him. He was a young kid. There's a bit of money. There's his father owns a business. I mean, life should have been good. It was just the timing of everything that happened. So what happens to your father after the night of Kristallnacht?
So the next day, he is dismissed from Schwarzschild Ochs with a glowing reference, it has to be said, but dismissed nonetheless, and arrested and sent with just about every other adult male German Jew to a concentration camp. Meanwhile, his father was arrested in Bamberg and ended up in Dachau. My father, where he was there for a month. He was only released, as many Jews were, in order to sign over ownership of his business to an Aryan. And ironically, Bamberg was a city that wasn't much damaged by Allied bombing during the war, but one of the few buildings that was flattened was my grandfather's shop. And in it at the time was the young Nazi who had acquired it from him for a knockdown price. So there was a certain gruesome justice.
Oh, yes. I'm not sure how I feel about that. You're right. I mean, it's all over the place. It's like on one hand, he deserves it. On the other hand, he is a human being. But
yeah,
that's the way it worked out. Yeah,
I think the irony would have been sufficient had the building been flattened. I'm not particularly joyous that he was in it at the time, but it's just one of those quirks of history. But my father was in Buchenwald for much longer. He was in for 5 months and through the winter of 38, 39. And I visited Buchenwald a couple of years ago when I was finalizing my research. And even now, there are very few buildings left there.
Right.
When at the end of the war, it was taken over by the Soviets, and it was so riddled with disease, typhus, and so on and so forth that they demolished most of the buildings. But even now, it is the most barren, desolate, forbidding place. And I can only imagine what my father went through in his 5 months there. And I say I can only imagine it because he never spoke about it. He wrote very little in his family history about it. I'm not really surprised, because if you've lived through that, why would you want to talk about it? Why would you want to relive it?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that, he had to go through it, I mean, and the fact that he's not saying anything, it must have been worse than we can possibly imagine. Going back to your grandfather, yes, the Jews were forced to sell their possessions, their businesses, pennies on the dollar. And as we're going to see, and as you point out in your book, there was a lot of financial transactions going on between the Jews and the Nazis, because the Nazis were going to find a way to get paid during all of this carnage and bloodshed. But going back to your father for a second, he receives a miracle of sorts, because somehow someone has either filled out the right form or pulled strings, or however it happened, that he's going to be able to go to the UK.
That's right. He says in his family history that he never found out who it was or what Jewish charity it was that put his name on a list, or how they came by his name, indeed. But he was able to leave Germany. He left on the 10th of May, 1939, so 5 months before the beginning of the war.
Right.
It has to be said that he was one of the relatively few German Jews who managed to get to this country. About 70,000 of the 500,000 who had applied for visas. So he was very lucky. He came here, however, on condition that he would only be here for 2 years, that he wouldn't be able to work without the permission of the Ministry of Labour, and so he had to subsist on handouts from Jewish charities, small kind of casual jobs that he could get with those charities. He was a doorman for some time at a community centre.
Right.
He did recount the story of how a very kind family of Quakers invited him once for Sunday lunch, but he couldn't turn up. He couldn't get there because he couldn't afford the tube fare, the underground train to get there. And he felt, for the rest of his life, he felt guilty that they might have felt that he hadn't appreciated their gesture. Right. But that was how destitute he and many other refugees were.
Can I say real quick that I was a little surprised at this part, because it's not like he's a 10-year-old boy or a 12-year-old boy. I mean, he's military age. You would think that the Nazis would make sure, quote unquote, that he could never fight against them. But however it happened, like you were saying, almost a miracle. Somebody filled out a form, some organization asked, and his name was put on a list, and now he's bound for England.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he was lucky in many ways, and sometimes you just, it's just impossible to understand how these kind of things come about. I mean, we talk about the gruesome coincidence of the man who acquired my grandfather's business, but my father, he escaped from Germany on the 10th of May, 1939. He was arrested on the 10th of May, 1940 by the British as an enemy alien. He had tried to enlist at the outbreak of war. And when he died in 2004, when my mother died in 2010, and my sister was clearing out our family home, she came across a trunk in a dark cupboard that I'd never known, I'd never seen before. I never knew it existed. But in that trunk were all kinds of artifacts of the past, including my father's Torah, his Old Testament, and his prayer shawl. Now, my father was, if anything, he was anti-religious, and yet he had kept, and he said that, he'd been brought up in a household that was not terribly religious, but his own father kept the holy days and was the chairman of the synagogue choir, but that was about as far as it went. My father said that whatever tenuous connection he still had to Judaism snapped in Buchenwald. He felt that this, a God that could wish this on his followers was not a God he wanted to follow himself. So, but nevertheless, he kept these items. He kept 700 letters that he and my mother exchanged almost on a daily basis when my father finally was in the British Army, was stationed in India. He kept 35 letters that had reached him from his own parents in Nazi Germany. And believe it or not, I've forgotten where I started. I mentioned the trunk. What was your question? What was your question?
You know what? I can't remember either. No, but I have to tell you, that was one of the most poignant part of the book. Your father, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, your father said something like, well, here's this God, all powerful, all knowing, we're his people, and we still get treated like this.
Yeah.
No, but it was poignant that he kept those things of his faith, even though he kind of moved away from the faith. He's like, no, I can't get rid of these. But yeah, I mean, how could he not be affected by his time in that camp? And he's only there because he is Jewish. I mean, how could he not have a reaction to that?
Well, absolutely. Incidentally, I've remembered now why I embarked.
Oh, please.
And that was because there was one other thing in that trunk, and that was a copy of a newspaper, the News Chronicle, which no longer exists. It was folded open on page 7, and there was a report, a news report, about the queue that had formed outside an army recruitment centre in London in the early part of the war. I think just October 1939, and they wrote about a young man who had been recently in the concentration camps in Germany, who was now very eager to join the British Army. And of course, although it didn't name him, was my father. But they turned him down on the basis that, he had a suspect background, and, which is pretty ironic, given that, he above all young men had a vested interest in fighting the Nazis. But anyway, a year later, he's arrested as an enemy alien and shipped across the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, to Canada. And the day before his ship, the Ettrick, left Liverpool, a similar ship, the Arandora Star, had been sunk by a torpedo from a German U-boat, and with much loss of life, including many Italians who'd been arrested and were also being shipped away as enemy aliens. And my father would have known this. So he and my uncle, as it happens, my maternal uncle, were on that ship, along with known Nazis, German Nazis, who'd been arrested also as enemy aliens, but with greater justification, and prisoners of war who'd been captured early in the conflict, and they were all shipped cheek by jowl to Canada, and that's where they stayed, more or less cheek by jowl, for the next 2 years. Prisoners of the British and the Canadians.
I wanted to ask, when he tried to join the military and was told no, was that more of a there's a chance that you could be a double agent versus we don't want you because you're Jewish? Was it more they couldn't be sure where his loyalties lie?
I think it was a bit of both, but more probably of the panic. This could be a fifth columnist, and it was being said at the time that the reason why the Nazis were finding it so easy to sweep west towards the Channel through France and the Low Countries was because they were being aided by regiments of fifth columnists, and so the panic, which is understandable to an extent, gripped the UK, but in the run up to the war, when German Jews were desperate to escape Nazi Germany, the UK, the US, and just about every other democracy, while wringing its hands over the excesses of the Nazis, made it extremely difficult for refugees to gain asylum in their countries, and much of that was fueled, I have to say, by a rather unpleasant anti-Semitism.
Yes, you covered that in your book as well. Germany's like, hey, okay, we want to get rid of our Jews. We don't want them here. Take them in. And a lot of countries would either not take them in or take in very little. And so this is not something that is just happening in Nazi Germany as well. And like you said, this goes back 2,000 years, so I'm not surprised that anti-Semitism is, scattered far and wide. So for your father, after 2 years of being in a camp, or whatever the proper term is, and please feel free to say anything else about your father that you want, but it does work out for him. He is eventually able to go back to England. He is to go into the army, but like you said, it's not like he's going to be sent to Europe. Maybe the brass still doesn't trust him, but he's on his way to faraway India.
Yes, after 2 years. I mean, he spends more time in those camps than most. I mean, it's
wow.
Fairly early on, after in May 1940, many refugees and German and Austrian refugees were arrested. The British realised they'd made a bit of a blunder. And they started releasing them. They were being held in camps on the Isle of Man, for example. My father was there quite briefly, and my uncle too. The British realized they'd made a bit of a mistake and started to release them. But unfortunately, they'd already contracted with the authorities in Canada and Australia that they were going to send them boatloads of prisoners. And they told the Canadians, they told the Australians that these were dangerous prisoners and had to be well guarded.
Right.
By the time they realized that actually they weren't, they thought, oh, this is a bit embarrassing, we'll send them anyway. And because they didn't have enough of the genuine Nazis that they'd rounded up, that they leavened, or they kind of balanced it out by sending some innocuous so-called enemy aliens like my father. So the whole thing was a total blunder.
Right.
And my father paid the price for it. But or having said that, he was better off imprisoned in Canada than he would have been in Buchenwald. So that has to be accepted and acknowledged. But when he finally made it back to the UK, he was able to enlist.
Right.
He was desperately keen to fight in the European theatre, but he was sent, instead of being sent out to defeat the Nazis, he was sent out to defend the empire. And so he ended up for 2 years in India. And at the end of the war, indeed, when he applied twice to be posted to Germany, which by then was conquered and occupied, and he, was able to present himself as an ideal candidate for an interpreter for the armed forces. But he also said to the British Army, I also want to go there because I want to try to find out what's happened to my family, to my parents. He twice applied and he was twice turned down. He was so critical to the defense of the empire that he couldn't spare him.
Exactly.
But it was pretty hard-headed, I have to say, of the authorities to make those decisions.
Yeah, a lot of mistakes were made, and they try to iron them out as best they can, but mistakes are mistakes, and he's got to live with it as best he can. So, in general, things work out for your father. He's able to, he obviously knew your mother. He exchanged letters, and so that's going to work out for him. However, there's other members of your extended family, your grandparents, your aunts, and your uncles, and this was another part of the book that I absolutely enjoyed. As poignant as it was also devastating to read. And by the way, can I just say to the listeners real quick, you write wonderfully. I absolutely loved the prose that you put down, but not to make you embarrassed or anything. But so you started listing these people. You would give a short bio, and then you would of course end their little story with their end. And after, I don't know how many of these people did not survive, it becomes gut wrenching, but this stuff does need to be set down on paper.
Well, I think it does. And I think we need to understand, how these things happen. As I said right at the outset, the question that confronted me when all the other questions had been answered was why? Why did this happen? And I say somewhere in the book that, anti-Semitism doesn't descend like debris from space.
Right.
It's more like an infection. George Orwell wrote very cogently on this matter. It's more like an infection that we carry. And sometimes it's abated and there are no symptoms. And sometimes they can be summoned, and they can have devastating results. And we need to understand the circumstances under which, bad things happen, not just to Jews. I mean, my family is Jewish, and my family had an experience that many Jewish people in Europe have had down the centuries, and then on a catastrophic scale in the middle of the 20th century. But other people were targeted by the Nazis, and other people have been the victims of genocide since. Yes. So it isn't just about Gentiles and Jews. It's about men and women who can do good things, and men and women who are also capable of doing bad things.
Can I just say real quick before you go on, that reminded me of something. I wrote it down here because it moved me. You compared anti-Semitism to a disease, and you said something like, if it stays around long enough, and we're finding this true with COVID, if it stays around long enough, it can mutate, reappear, and maybe you don't recognize it at first, but it's still those same negative feelings just wrapped in a new package.
Well, I think that's right. And of course, anti-Semitism has mutated over the centuries. You can find its origins perhaps in the Bible, with some of the sentiments of St. Matthew, St. Paul. But then it really becomes a big issue in the 4th century, when there really was a contest between the Christian church, the young Christian church, and the established synagogue for, dominance. And the Christian church prevailed. But at that time, there were Christians like St. Augustine who preached against the Jews, but he nevertheless saw that they served a divine purpose, because ultimately the Jews would be converted, and when they were converted, that would usher in, the end of days. And so Jews must be preserved, albeit in dejected and subservient state. So I wouldn't say Augustine was much of a champion of the Jews, but he wasn't actually as virulently opposed to them as other of his contemporaries and near contemporaries, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. John Chrysostom, who preached the most abominable libels against Jews, and of course established for all time this accusation that they were the Christ slayers and abominated by God. And this was absolutely critical to the beliefs of the early church. But the one thing that Augustine, Gregory, and John Chrysostom had in common is that they are all saints, and they continue to be saints and recognized and revered as such in all the major Christian churches, despite what they preached and its impact on Jews down the centuries.
Right.
But we're familiar with the medieval persecutions and the Inquisition, and incidentally, this country, the UK, which prides itself on its steadiness, its reasonableness, and its tolerance, of course, was the very first country that expelled its entire Jewish population, and that was in 1290.
That's right.
And Jews were not readmitted to England until 1656. More than 350 years later. So I think it's quite interesting to wonder, to speculate as to whether Shakespeare, who established this kind of iconic Jewish stereotype in Shylock, whether he in his lifetime had actually even met a Jew. But
wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, and indeed, the blood libel was made in Britain. The blood libel, which is the accusation that Jews kidnap and murder Christian children and use their blood in the leavening of matzahs at Passover. And this occurred first in Norwich, in the east of England, spread across the continent. So, we, in this country, while we may have the right to congratulate ourselves to an extent, it's only to an extent. We're as infected, frankly, as others in Europe were at the time. But then this wasn't simply a feature of the Roman teaching or the Roman Church. Martin Luther the champion of the Reformation, was even more vehement in his anti-Semitism, or his anti-Judaism, to be more correct, because anti-Semitism was really an invention of the 19th century. But before then, we'd had the progressive thinkers of the Enlightenment, who were anti-clerical, anti-religion, many of them, but they still were opposed to Jews and to Judaism, many of them in fairly outspoken terms. Voltaire, Tom Paine, William Cobbett, but many others said, we've got nothing against the Jews, so long as they stop being Jewish. You know?
So,
if they want to be like us,
then fine.
Then they should have the same rights as we do. But so long as they want to be Jewish and worship their Jewish gods, then frankly they're beyond the pale. But it was only in the 19th century that these religion-based objections to Judaism and to Jews became something else, and something actually even more dangerous, which was anti-Semitism based on race, on blood and race. Because if you were before this time, if you were at risk of persecution from Christians, you did have an option, limited though it was, and undesirable though it was to many Jews. You could convert to Christianity, often at the point of a sword.
Right.
But nevertheless, there may be some form of escape for you. Although, you know, in the time of the Inquisition, Jews who had converted came under increasing suspicion that they might be backsliding and so on and so forth. So to have been a Jew was almost as dangerous as to continue to be a Jew. But in the 19th century, this changed, because if you were Jewish by race, there was no way that you could escape. And of course, that is precisely why and how so many millions of Jews perished in the Holocaust. They had not only no escape from being Jewish, they had no escape from the countries that meant them harm.
Can I just say that was, again, it was well written, but it was one of the most heartbreaking parts of your book. You mentioned, in the New Testament, you mentioned Constantine, the first Roman Christian emperor. You mentioned the 4th century blood libel, the Martin Luther, the things that he said against Jewish. And you're right, but like you said, you've got these intellectual giants, the pop stars of their day, if you will, saying horrible things about Jews and they should be treated a certain way. And as bad as all that is, the moment it goes from being a matter of faith to a matter of blood, well, now there's nothing they can do. In fact, they're subhuman. They're not quite as good as I am as a human being, as a Christian, a Protestant, or whatever. And when you have that as your basis, then yes, you're free to do anything to them that you want, and they don't deserve mercy because they're not quite as human as you are. I mean, that is just a brilliant but brutal system set up.
Yes, and you're quite right. The first step is to render your enemy subhuman, because once you've done that, then the normal rules don't apply. You don't have to treat these people the way that you would treat your neighbor, even if you've just cordially despised your neighbor, and eventually these people become no more than vermin. And one of the reasons why my grandparents found themselves in the horrible predicament in which they were was because they were from an older generation to my father and his cousins, the generation that had a chance of getting away. And they had a chance of getting away for a number of reasons. Firstly, they had something perhaps to offer countries of sanctuary. They had their brains or their brawn. They had economic value. My grandparents were approaching their 60s, and they had little economic value. In fact, countries like the UK and the US felt that there would be a drain on their resources, on their taxpayers' hard-earned dollars. And that's one of the reasons why they were not prepared to open the doors to them, despite the danger they faced. But the other reason was because my grandparents' generation were patriotic Germans. I mentioned that my grandfather was a Prussian. He was He was in the army during the First World War. He and many like him could not believe that, despite the Nazi propaganda, despite everything that happened from 1933 onwards, he couldn't believe that they would do to him and to his family what they ultimately did. And so when he had a chance, perhaps, to get away, he didn't take it. And then it was too late. I mean, I tell the story of my grandmother's brother, Ernst, which I find very poignant. He was a bachelor. He had fought in the First World War. Mm-hmm. He'd been on the front line. He was an officer. He won the Iron Cross, despite the fact he never actually pulled the trigger in anger. He never actually fired his gun at the enemy because he was a pacifist.
Right.
He'd survived the war on the front line as a pacifist, but still won the Iron Cross.
Wow.
After the war, he'd been injured in the war. He declined the pension that he had earned because he felt that there were others who needed it more than he did. So here was this guy who was really heroic in many ways, but he was rounded up in the very first roundup of Jews. And he was shipped to, he'd been in Dachau too. In fact, he'd volunteered to go to Dachau. He was actually exempt because he was fairly senior in an old veterans organization, but he volunteered to go with his fellow Jews to Dachau. And then in the first roundup of mass roundup of Jews for deportation, he was shipped to a camp in the south of France. It was the only westward deportation of Jews in that period, and he was held at a place called Gurs in the foothills of the Pyrenees, but he ended up ultimately in Auschwitz, and this was a German hero. Right. If it happened to him, it's not that hard to see how it happened to so many others of his generation.
Absolutely right. So you're sitting there telling that story, and I actually had to think, if I had to put myself in his shoes, you're going to kick me out of the country, but I'm a German. I'm a patriot. I am loyal to my country. Yes, I'm Jewish, but I'm also German, and that wasn't good enough for the authorities because they could only see the Jew in him. And so I imagine he and most of your other extended family did not have the same fortunate outcome as your father did.
No, I think probably about 40 members of my father's and my mother's family perished in the Holocaust. They would have been mostly, but not exclusively, of that generation. There were others who were my father's age, his cousins, and their small children. There were many of that generation who died too, but I think it was the older people who had failed to see the signs or to heed the warnings, and ultimately they simply couldn't conceive of what was facing them. And then when they could see what fate had in store with them, they were trapped. It was too late. Couldn't get out.
If I could real quick, I'd like to just juxtapose something you just said with something you said earlier. So, yeah, a lot of people are thinking it can't get that bad, or the Nazis aren't that crazy or whatever. But obviously at some point, people figure out, yes, this is for real, and they're going to go as far as they can. Now, earlier you said there were some people in other countries or wherever in Europe that resisted the Nazis, that tried to help people. Can you think of any of those, maybe one of those stories you would like to share with us as far as someone going, this is wrong, yes, it's dangerous, but I'm going to oppose this political movement as I see it and try to help somebody?
Yeah, and I think it's important. You know, my book deals with some pretty dark subject matter, and some of the worst things that people can do to each other. But it's really important for me, and I hope for readers to know that life doesn't have to be that way. But it does depend on choices that we make, and that's the glory of living in a democracy. That you have the right to choose your government, you have the right to hold them to account. You have you have choices to make, and my plea is that people make the right choices. Now, many people in that dark period made the wrong choices or allowed others to make choices on their behalf. But there were people and there were countries that resisted. To some extent, you could make a case for Bulgaria, and for Finland too. But the shiny example is Denmark. They had a small Jewish community, and they were occupied, the Danes, from early in the war. But it was relatively late in the course of the war when the Nazis decided to deport the Jewish community from Denmark to the camps, actually specifically to Theresienstadt in what was then Czechoslovakia. And the Danes simply decided this wasn't going to happen. They didn't distinguish between a Jewish and a non-Jewish Dane, and they were not going to allow anybody else to do that either. They had a very keen sense of identity. They were socially progressive. They had very distinct values, and they said this is not going to happen. And so almost overnight, they hid their entire Jewish community, and then in a small or a flotilla of small boats, spirited them over the water to neutral Sweden, where the vast majority of Danish Jews survived.
Wow.
And that was because people took a decision. They had a clear view of what was right and what was wrong, and they decided to uphold what was right, even at their own personal risk. Now, there were lots of contributory factors that actually made it easier for them to do what they did than might otherwise have been the case. And I think we need to be clear-sighted about that. But nothing, in my mind, undermines the courage and the heroism of the Danes, and the fact that they were determined, when they could have made an easier choice, to make the right choice.
That's amazing. I did not know that. So the vast majority of those Jews survived because of the courage and that is uplifting, and that is a great way to end the show. But I certainly do recommend to everybody to check this book out, The History of the Holocaust, the way you covered your families. And of course, again, it was well written. I enjoyed it very much. For all the listeners out there, the book is called The Last Train, A Family History of the Final Solution. Mr. Bradley, thank you very much for this book and for your time today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about it. It's very good of you.